Good evening, everyone. I'm David Schizer, co-director of the Richard Paul Richmond Center for Law, Business, and Public Policy. The Richmond Center is a joint venture of Columbia Business School and Columbia Law School. We formed this partnership because we believe that some of the most important issues are best understood by examining both their business and their legal implications. This is certainly true of economic insecurity, so we're very proud to host this panel discussion of The Wolf at the Door, a book by Michael Graetz and Ian Shapiro. For this evening's discussion, we are fortunate to have a wonderful moderator. Nick Lemann is the Pulitzer Professor of Journalism and Dean Emeritus of Columbia Journalism School. He himself is a noted author. His most recent book was Transaction Man in 2019. Nick served as Dean of Columbia's Journalism School from 2003 to 2013. We overlapped for 9 years as deans, so I know how thoughtful he is, and I leave you in good hands. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And it's a pleasure to be here and welcome everybody who's in the audience. I'm going to let me give a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon that's kind of at the bottom toward the right. So if you have questions as this event goes on, please go to Q&A and write them in there. I'm not going to go to Q&A immediately. It'll be later in the event, and I'll mention as we get a ways into it, I'll prompt you to put questions in. So you don't need to do it right away, but it's a free country and you can put them in right away, but just be aware that it's there. And the questions should go there and not into the chat, please. So let me then introduce our panelists. If we put that slide back on. Michael Graetz is and I'm giving introductions that are, 2 to 3% of the introductions I could give, just in the interest of using our time and getting into this. Michael Graetz is Columbia Alumni Professor of Tax Law at Columbia Law School. Jacob, or as we know him, Jack Lew, is the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and visiting Professor of International and Public Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And again, these are just a tiny soupçon of the many distinctions and roles that our panelists have had. So Michael's book is called The Wolf at the Door, The Menace of Economic Insecurity and How to Fight It. He has a co-author, Ian Shapiro, who is a distinguished political scientist at Yale, who couldn't be here tonight. So Michael, we're going to start with you and just talk a little bit about what's in the book. I want to start with a question, which is, a lot of the discussion around the issues you talk about in the book is framed around the word inequality. And you've made a choice to use the defining term insecurity rather than inequality. Why did you do that, and what does insecurity mean?
Well, we did it in large part because we were concerned that the political discussion in the U.S., particularly from the left, had really focused all of the attention on the millionaires and billionaires, as Bernie Sanders likes to call them.
Millionaires and billionaires.
better put.
Accurately.
And, the Occupy movement had as a rallying cry, "We are the 99%. And Ian and I were very clear that there is no effective coalition for getting something done in American politics of the 99%. It now turns out we realize that you can't get 99% of the people to agree on anything in America today. And so this was not an effective coalition. And what we were trying to do was to shift the spotlight to the economic insecurity of families in the middle and below, in large part because for us, the 2016 election in the United States, where Bernie Sanders had far more success than anyone had predicted, and we elected someone who claimed to be a populist who was playing on anger, fear, resentment of the middle class and below, created a situation of populist jargon and what we regarded as snake oil solutions to genuine economic problems that the American families were facing. And so our effort was to shine a spotlight down the income scale to those families that were struggling and that were confronted with what we regarded as unprecedented economic insecurity now and going forward, even though the economy was strong when the book was published.
So let's spend a minute just kind of nailing down the insecurity point. Us, whom you see on the screen, or shall we say, just past the first flush of youth, I think. So I think all of us can remember a pretty different world with respect to security. I mean, just my personal story. So David said I'm a journalist. So I went to work for the Washington Post in 1979, which is a kind of baseline moment in your book, Michael. And I was in my 20s. And you basically walked in and they sat you down, you had an orientation. They said, kid, if you keep your nose clean, you will work here your entire life. And you'll retire with a pension and you'll have, you won't get paid great money, but basically you should consider this lifetime employment. Now, I don't know if you all had moments like that in your early life, but that's a world that doesn't really exist anymore, right?
Exactly. I mean, it is, for graduates of Columbia University or any of the Ivy League schools, they regard the fact that they're going to change jobs 10 or 12 times over a lifetime as an opportunity. It's an adventure. But for the rest of America, and especially people who are middle-aged and trying to hold families together and provide the kinds of opportunities for their children, that's an extremely frightening prospect, that their jobs are no longer lifetime jobs, and they don't even know whether their jobs could disappear in the next year or so. And the other fact, and then I'll be interested to hear from Jack on this, but the other fact that we really focused on was that even when the economy was strong before the virus hit, nearly half of American families had told the Federal Reserve that if they had a $400 emergency, they could not pay it off in cash or with a credit card that they could pay off at the end of the month. And those numbers are higher for Blacks and for Latinos in the United States. But that's a shocking number. And so that tells you that not only are they insecure in their jobs, but they're also insecure because they don't have a cushion to fall back on. They don't have significant savings. At least that's true for the vast bulk of American families.
Jack, do you want to come in on the foregoing, any part of?
Yeah. I went to Washington for the first time to work in 1973. And in 1973, if you were to broadly ask what is the kind of definition of a middle-class job, the answer would have been a manufacturing job. It still would have been the kind of place you described. With Washington Post wasn't alone. It could have been in the machine parts business or in the auto business. The likelihood was if you went
at the Washington Post, what I just said would be true in the newsroom, in the business department, and in the press room.
Correct, in the press room too. And that had a lot of attributes to it, that people still largely had pensions because they were with an employer that they started and finished with. The pension reform law that we now live with was written at that time. It was the first piece of legislation I worked on. But the idea was that you worked for an employer, the employer was loyal to you, you were loyal to the employer, there was training, there was job security. there was a social safety net around it. I don't think we changed our focus, that the goal was to create good manufacturing jobs from then until now. But I think people's sense that there was security in that kind of work changed dramatically. I mean, I was shocked in the early, like in 2010, it was hard to find people to apply for manufacturing jobs. And it wasn't considered something you encouraged your kids to do in some communities because it was considered insecure. It might be there now, it wouldn't be there later. So I think something quite dramatic did change. And I think Michael and Ian deserve credit for focusing on this concept of insecurity, because whether it's in the workplace or in terms of access to healthcare or in terms of housing, or, as Michael said, to have a safety net if there was a rainy day, living without security in those areas changes your worldview. And I think we're in an environment now where a lot of people in the middle feel that insecurity.
And of course, as you point out in the book, this is not just a US phenomenon. You see this all over the developed world, really, especially in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's worth stopping for a minute on manufacturing, because I think it's so important to where we are now and where we've come. We talked to a lot of people in and around Youngstown, Ohio, and we picked Youngstown because every president in my lifetime almost has visited Youngstown, at least since the 1970s, and said, we're going to bring the manufacturing jobs back to Youngstown. And Youngstown was a thriving steel industry, and in the late 70s, largely due to imports of steel from Japan at the time, but not just that, this Youngstown steel and pipe closed, and Youngstown was devastated. And it's now a town where it's got half the population that it once had. The steel mill there is a French-owned steel mill producing rolled pipe for pipelines and the like, steel pipe, with about 300 workers, all of whom are making about $100,000 or more, and huge machines doing the work that used to be done on an assembly line. And they're not interested in unionization. You ask them about unions and they have no interest in it. And the decline of unions is an important part of our story. And yet everybody keeps coming back to Youngstown and saying, we're going to bring those jobs back. And I think that's a mistake. And if you look at the towns that have been hit by imports, towns like Allentown, Pennsylvania, not far away, or Hickory, North Carolina, which was slammed by Chinese furniture imports in the early part of this century. The towns that have thrived in response are the towns that have diversified into services and technology and other businesses. And I don't think our politicians, frankly, are doing the American people a great service when they claim they're going to bring back all these manufacturing jobs. Technology is going to continue to take manufacturing jobs. And as we know, low-wage workers, the textile industry was hollowed out from New England. I mean, we could just go industry by industry in the United States, and where there are cars being manufactured, they've moved from the Midwest to the South, which is not unionized, and the wages are lower even in manufacturing jobs, and they're very uncertain, as Jack said.
But just to stay on that point of technology for a moment, I was struck in the 2013, 14, 15 period that we were seeing rising manufacturing outputs at a pretty comfortable rate, but we weren't seeing the job growth that you would have seen in the past. And I came to view it as being just a pattern that the manufacturing jobs that came back were jobs where technology could be substituted for labor, and where the quality of the work environment, the markets, with the stability of the United States made the United States more attractive. In the industries where it was still labor intensive, they weren't coming back. And I don't know that changes if you remain a high wage country, which we want to be, which means you have to think about how do people learn to do other things, not just recreate the old pattern.
So let me, I mean, most of what I'd like to talk about is sort of looking forward, but I'd like to spend a minute looking backward. And, you know, I've been interested in and have written about some of these same developments. In the American economy, you know, you can pose in a number of ways. Why does productivity growth not lead to equitable distribution of income? Why does manufacturing growth not lead to job growth? So several years ago, I was invited to give a lecture at Stanford, and I had this sort of scary moment at the end of the lecture where I'm describing all of this happening, and the then very old and now deceased economist Kenneth Arrow got up and said, "My dear boy, it was all inevitable." So I want to ask you both, was it all inevitable? Why did this happen? Why did in an economy that seemed to sort of work for everybody, you know, evidently stop working for everybody? Could it have been prevented?
Well, I don't think it could be prevented. I mean, there are two major forces that we need to talk about, and they've had very different impacts, I think, and will have very different impacts going forward. The first is the opening up of markets and globalization and the decline in transportation costs, which is very, very dramatic. And that has allowed offshoring, that has allowed US multinationals to thrive. And it's taken huge numbers of people out of poverty, but they're mostly in Asia, some are in Africa. And so globalization has been good globally for a lot of people who were in poverty and in deep poverty. But it hasn't been good for the workforce in the United States for the reasons you describe. And I think if we learned anything from the pandemic about the future, it is how quickly we can shift technologically now in ways that were just unheard of. I mean, this event with, you know, whatever number of hundreds of people scattered around wherever they are, being able to watch in on a platform that has really improved even during the last year. So I think going forward, the biggest threat to a lot of these jobs, and particularly manufacturing jobs, is technology and not globalization. I think we've passed the globalization, but they work together. The last thing I'll say on this is they do work together. That is, you know, somebody sitting in Seattle can know exactly how many Nike shoes are being sewed in a Vietnamese factory because they've got technology that enables them to watch it, to count the shoes and everything else. And so there is a synergy there between technology and globalization that I think has enabled, particularly in the case of consumer goods, televisions, textiles, and the like, production at very, very cheap costs that has benefited American consumers, but has not benefited American wages.
Jack, do you want to answer anything he said or this question about what could have been done to prevent all this from happening?
I think historically, if you think about the world before World War II and since World War II, we went into World War II with a trade war that destroyed the global economy. We came out of World War II with a world that was destroyed in Europe and Asia, and the only manufacturing engine in the world was the United States. We ran from roughly the end of World War II to the early 1970s in a world where the goal was to avoid war and to avoid the economic pain of trade wars. Perhaps we didn't anticipate that when people in Asia rise out of poverty, they take American jobs because America's economy wasn't going to grow new areas of employment that were attractive. Perhaps that was a failure. I wasn't active in policy in the 60s. So I can't, from my own experience, speak to that. But by the time we saw the impact of trade, which candidly was before technology, and I agree with Michael, technology is the bigger, we were not terribly effective as a government responding to the dislocations, the unequal impact of the disruption. And we came to believe that if the pie grew, everyone would be better off, and therefore it was a good thing. But meanwhile, the economy wasn't distributing security equally. And from 1975 to 2000, a large part of the middle of the country came to believe that nobody was really worried about it. And as technology is hitting, confidence in government is eroding.
So many things to talk about here, but let me land for a moment on your and Ian's point about coalition building. And I want to ask Jack about this too, but start with Michael. So essentially, why is it that what is the political coalition that you see available around a framing of insecurity that isn't available around a framing of inequality? Who's in the coalition?
Well, I think the key, and I appreciate your asking about coalitions, because our book is really focused on legislative politics and not electoral politics, and therefore it's focused on coalitions and not the median voter or attracting the middle voter in order to win an election. I mean, what has happened is that in the political arena, and here I include the state legislatures as well as the Congress, the average American has lost his or her voice. That is, labor unions, which were robust during the post-war period that Jack describes, and really started to decline in the 70s for a whole series of reasons, represented the working family in the Congress and in the state legislatures, and that has broken down. We know about money in politics, and I'll say nothing about that. But I think what's happened is that business interests, both small businesses, which the Democrats and Republicans love, and large businesses, which only some people love, have really become the major force in creating a coalition, keeping a coalition together. You can get something done when business splits and you have business on two sides of an issue. But if business is not in you, if you have no business interest in your coalition in Congress or in a state legislature, you're very unlikely to win. And this is why in our book, we do two things. One is we really talk quite explicitly about the need for businesses to move away from shareholder myopia, if you will, and benefits only to shareholders, and to think about employees and communities as they are starting to talk about, at least now. And so we talk a lot about that. And we also have tried to come up with viable policies that will enhance economic security, that are ideas that business can get around, and that business could be in a coalition, not all businesses, and certainly not all businesses all the time, but that there would be important business support in order to get any number of the things done that we talk about in terms of policy. And so I think that's crucial. I think it would be nice if there were more organizations. I was involved just this week in a number of conversations in the European Union, and there the NGOs and the unions are still stronger than they are here, but there are non-government organizations that have come up and have really been creating a voice, a powerful voice for people who are voiceless in America's political process.
Jack, let me ask you, you can comment on any of that, but when you're working in government, how do you deal with the politics versus policy question? That is, do you sit around in meetings when policy, merits are being discussed, and also discuss what coalition would back this if it's the right policy?
Well, may have my own idiosyncratic approach, and it's actually what I teach as well. So I stick to it. I think you have to do your level best to develop policy without thinking first about the politics. It inevitably constrains your choices, sometimes in ways they need to be constrained, and sometimes in ways they don't. So you ought to start out with a North Star of what is the best outcome. And I remember when I was very young in politics, and I worked for the Speaker of the House, Speaker O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, and he made it very clear he was pretty good at the politics. He hired people like me to kind of figure out where he should try to go, knowing his values and his objectives. And that's a model that I actually have carried with me. The politics enter into what is possible, but it ought not to define where you start out in terms of defining an ideal. And I'm never embarrassed about compromise, which is a reasonable outcome, though maybe not the ideal from my perspective or whoever I'm negotiating with. But if I know what I'm giving up and what they're giving up, and we're getting to something that may be second best, but it's a lot better than nothing, that's actually the political process working. Sadly, what I just described is considered almost corrupt in modern politics. Compromising is not a word that people consider to be a great honorable word nowadays. And we see the kind of pitched partisan battles in their place. I think one of the things that Michael and I have talked about over the years, and I know the book was aiming to do, was to try to develop things where he and I might not agree on every idea that's in the book. But there's nothing in the book that reasonable people can't talk about and figure out where do they agree? Where can they go forward? And can you solve the underlying problem? We don't have a lot of that in the current policy debate.
I want to go to some of the specifics in the book, but I want to press you.
Can I just tell a story about politics on this point? So when I was in the Treasury as a very young person, the first time, I got involved with Paul Volcker and John Connally when the U.S. was moving off of fixed exchange rates into floating exchange rates because there had been a run on the dollar and the run on gold. And I spent a lot of meetings because Connally was of the view that this was a political problem and Volcker was of the view this was an economic problem. And I was tasked, along with some others, of figuring out the politics of this for Connally. And I'll make a long story short, but we had a lot of meetings with the CIA. We discovered that all the French cared about was the price of gold and the relationship of the French then franc to the German mark, and that the French were the key player in all of this. And then we could devalue by a lot. But if you didn't solve the French problem, which was a purely political problem for the French, not an economic problem, the gold had no economic relevance to them, it was all political. If you didn't solve the problem for the French, you weren't going to solve the problem at all. And so I think since then, and then I was, I worked closely with the tax writing committees over a very long time in the Congress, and I think that Jack is exactly right. You have to ask yourself, what is it you want in terms of policy? But you need to think about the politics as well. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes our book unique. There are a lot of good books on policy, and there are quite a few good books on politics, but there are very few books that take both politics and policy seriously and think, Nick, as you suggested, what is a coalition and what would a coalition support? What would an effective coalition support by way of policy?
So I want to sort of press you on something you said before. So if you stipulate that essentially business, business is a big category, obviously, but that business is essential to any successful political coalition. I think I heard that correctly, right? Then why should business participate in an effort to create more economic security? You have the shareholder revolution that took place in the, that you talk about, that took place in the 70s and 80s and beyond. So a lot of corporate executives think it's my job, it's my legal responsibility to privilege shareholder value above things like being a good citizen. And then you have this sort of the consumer revolution, which you also alluded to. People like having cheap, fabulous TVs rather than paying more for a television or more for a car, knowing that they're helping create economic security for workers. So how would the necessary players be induced to participate in this?
Well, we focus on a number of things, and I think it's important to put it in context. Our main focus is on creating jobs, making work pay better, and then creating a safety net for unemployment, for health insurance, for childcare, things that we've seen very vividly in the last year. And in each of these contexts, there are policies that are advantageous to business in all sorts of ways. Just to take one specific example, we talk a lot about infrastructure, which Jack had a lot to do with when he was at the Treasury and had some terrific ideas about, which he's shared with Ian and I. And, things like rural broadband. It's not just fixing airports and roads and bridges and so forth, but it's fixing broadband in rural areas that allows people to participate in the economy today and so forth. That's all very advantageous to business, all sorts of businesses. You don't have to have all businesses in that, but you need to have some support from business, I think, in order to really move forward in an important way to create economic security. And it is in their interest to have a workforce that is not suffering all the time from economic insecurity, and to have communities where their businesses are operating that are robust and good places to live. And otherwise, you see things like employer-based health insurance, which is an accident of history. It doesn't work for the employee, but it also doesn't work for the employer. And there are a lot of policies, I think, like that, that would achieve security for their workers and actually ultimately contribute over the long term to the
I think the political challenge is that businesses tend to focus most of their energy on the issues that are specific to them and that matter directly and immediately, and much less so on the issues that create better infrastructure, both in terms of the physical and the kind of social supports for their long-term interest. I once asked Vice President Cheney, when he was still a CEO, before he was vice president, why that was the case. And he said, we were discussing trade policy at the time. And he said, it's easy. You only have so much ability to influence the public debate as a CEO, and you save your real effort for the things that matter to your business. I think what's changed is that these issues of insecurity undermine the whole enterprise of our free market liberal democracy. And if there isn't a coming together around strengthening it, then the crisis the next time around will be very much against the interests of the business that was asleep at the switch today. How you get that into the corporate thinking, I'm not an expert in. There's been a lot of discussion of that over the last 18 months. I haven't seen as much action.
Right. Well, Michael, let's go to some specific ideas in the book. And, I can tick off some, or you can tick off some. just to prompt you, I'll just list a few and then you can talk more. The earned income tax credit, infrastructure building, which you mentioned before, preschool and better childcare. Well, let's start with those and just talk about some of the specific policy ideas that you think would be most helpful.
Well, the Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the key anti-poverty programs that we've had. It was supported by Republican and Democratic administrations over a long time, beginning in 1975. It has lifted a lot of working families out of poverty. It increases their take-home pay. And so it enables people in low-wage jobs or middle-wage jobs to take home more money than their employer is paying them. The financing of it is quite progressive, so it's coming out of largely the U.S. income tax in terms of its financing. States have built on it, so you have an easy way for states to top it up if they want to. The structure's in place, it works, and yet it leaves single people completely behind, and it doesn't go quite high enough, in my view, into the middle class. And so it's a structure that's there, it's in place, it can be built on. You know, it's a place that business should be supporting it, and has been very effective. You know, preschool and childcare is a really interesting topic. We really focus a lot on pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, and while those of us in the East Coast corridor are aware of what cities like Boston, New York, and Washington have done in supporting universal pre-K. You also find very red states. Alabama, for example, was given the highest marks by people who grade quality pre-K. Oklahoma has been very successful. And that's a program that I think everybody can get around. And so, I mean, the other thing to be said about that is that I think that there was a lot of resistance. You know, Richard Nixon proposed and then vetoed a Child Care Act when he was president because he thought it would be communist to have other people than their mother raising the child. And that is such an archaic idea that I think the support for things like universal pre-K and good quality childcare have grown, and I think that there is a coalition that can be put together. All of these coalitions need leadership and need resources, and I don't think that the leadership necessarily is going to come from the business community. I think the leadership is going to come out of the White House or out of the Congress or out of political leaders in states and localities. But they need to convince the business community, as Jack suggested, that they've got a lot to lose if they don't support these kinds of policies.
I think some of these issues actually are quite amenable still to people for very different political points of view agreeing. I mean, when Paul Ryan was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and when he was speaker, one of the things that we could have worked with him on if we were in an environment where you could get things done was the Earned Income Tax Credit. It was actually an issue that he and we had different technical approaches to, but generally a similar view on. And it was the dysfunction of the political environment that made it impossible to make progress on that. I think that the political dysfunction is very deep on anything that isn't very much being demanded by the most powerful. So tax cuts are something that the business community comes behind and can move through when there's a new Republican administration. It happens almost every time. Things like expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, in my experience, is usually something that comes out of a complex negotiation with many parts. it doesn't have the energy to make it on its own. And if you don't have those moments where there's a lot of complex things being balanced, you don't get progress on something like the earned income tax credit.
Well, so this leads to another question about politics and policy and coalitions and so on. So, you know, everybody knows that the basic problem you're talking about in the book exists. And, you know, it's actually, there's some, you know, as different as they are, the slogan, Make America Great Again, and the slogan, Build Back Better, are referring to the same reality. And it's the reality that drives your book. You know, the idea that the American economy used to work for most people much better than it does now. As you hear solutions kind of in the public square and from activists, you often hear a series of solutions proposed that you, Michael and Ian, don't like that much. So I want to just mention some of those in both the specific sense and also to ask kind of, why are you so confident there's a politics behind things like the earned income tax credit, which most people have never heard of, even though many millions of people benefit from it, that can make it more successful. So just to tick off a few, higher federal minimum wage, extended unemployment, antitrust, which you don't even mention in the book, but I assume by not, I don't think you mention it. So by not mentioning it, you know, break up big tech, things like that. I assume by not mentioning it, you don't think it's the magic solution to these problems. You know, there's a series of these, of those kinds of solutions. Free college would be another one that seem to have sort of lift out there in the public mind and power people like Bernie Sanders and AOC. So why aren't those good ideas? And again, why would there be a better politics around kind of more technical ideas that people aren't that aware of?
Well, thanks, Nick. We do talk about the minimum wage, and we're supportive of the minimum wage. We prefer the earned income tax credit, but we think the minimum wage has been too low. We don't talk about antitrust. I don't believe it is a silver bullet for economic insecurity. Far from it. I think it's a very complicated problem, and of course, you can only talk about a certain number of things in one book. I do want to talk about unemployment because I think I mean, one of the big important ideas in the book is moving from a system of unemployment that we now have, which came in 1935 when Roosevelt knew he wanted a national program, but he was fearful that the Supreme Court of that day wouldn't validate a national program, and so he created—
With good reason.
With good reason, yes, absolutely, with good reason. No longer, I think, with good reason, but he created 50 state programs and modeled it after a Florida estate tax provision, which is really a very low relevance, but has been with us ever since. And then in 1960s, John Kennedy came up with something he called trade adjustment assistance. And trade adjustment assistance was designed to move people who lost their jobs because of the opening of global markets to new jobs and to help them get reemployed. And that failed for a whole another set of reasons, not the least of which was that an employee had to prove that he lost his job due to trade rather than any other reason, and it made it very difficult, and Congress didn't fund it. And we argue that we ought to have a program that's a national program for moving people from unemployment to reemployment. And one of the things that was interesting as we were writing the book was how invisible the unemployment idea was, and how impossible, of course, it was to get a coalition of anybody who thought of themselves as the future unemployed. I mean, we all think of ourselves as future retired persons, and so the Association of Retired People does very well in the political arena, but we don't think of ourselves as the future unemployed, and neither does anybody else. And one thing that the pandemic has done is shine a spotlight on just how fragile people's jobs are, how massive unemployment can hit completely unexpectedly. And Congress has, over the past year, been creating a national system of unemployment insurance to cover those independent contractors and freelancers who would not have been covered at all, and to make sure that people who would not have been covered by the states, which have had something of a race to the bottom, are covered. And it's a crisis. But every 6 months or so now, we seem to be arguing about what the new patch is on this very badly broken system. And there doesn't yet seem to be the kind of focus that we would hope for on trying to do something structural to solve this problem that Congress is coming back to. You know, every 3 or 4 months, it comes back to talk about it. Every 6 months or so, it makes a new law. There's one passed in December and one before them now. If you look at a report by the Congressional Budget Office that came out just yesterday, they say that we're not going to be back to the levels of unemployment that we had in February for a decade, until 2031. And so we've got to provide for people who are unemployed. Everybody else does it, but we don't. And it's a huge challenge. And so this for us is a priority. And we don't think that college is going to solve the problem, and we don't think that antitrust is going to solve the problem. The problem has to be addressed directly, and this is a huge gap in the insecurity of families, because the benefits, even if you're covered, have been so low that they don't keep a low-wage worker out of poverty. And so you immediately find yourself in poverty with no resources.
Let me ask a question. I'll put this to Jack first, but Michael, you may want to chime in, and it gets to populism. So populism in the developed world, and certainly in the US, has a sort of geographic component, at least to some extent. That is, when you look at the map of what parts of Britain voted for Brexit, if you look at the red versus blue maps of the US, if you look at county level maps, there's some statistic like 50% of the counties voted for Bush and 50% for Gore, or close to it. 85% of the counties voted for Trump. So you get the picture of, and a lot of this is in the data that Raj Chetty and his team have produced that you're both familiar with, that prosperity and opportunity increasingly exist in, and a more optimistic and less angry outlook exist in larger metropolitan areas, more likely to be on the coasts, and in more rural central areas, there's much more anger, distress, deaths of despair, all those things. So how do you address places that give rise to this kind of populist discontent as places, or do you?
Well, I think those places have different a number of other characteristics. I think if you look at college-educated populations, they overlap with the urban and more affluent populations. People who have more portable skills and more resilient career paths. If you are in a community where the thing you know how to do doesn't need to be done, whether it's a pulp mill in Oregon or a pipe mill in Ohio, when the business is no longer there, you don't have anything to do with your career. So I think part of the answer is education. We have not done a very good job. Trade adjustment assistance was supposed to be a combination of keeping you with an income stream while you got the skills to adapt to a changing economy. We turned out not to be terribly effective at delivering the income replacement or the training. We have to be better at that. And we have to think about it not just at a moment when you're trying to pass a trade bill, or not just at a moment when there's some crisis. I think that the middle of the country feels ignored by the elites. I think you're a little narrowly defining populism in the United States, though, as right-wing populism.
Yeah.
I think we have left and right-wing populism, and they're in different places. I mean, right. Brexit is probably a better example of what you're describing in some ways, where the urban vote was for union and the rural vote was against it. And it was also disproportionate counties.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. You know, in a book he wrote in the 90s, Tom Friedman, you know, made the observation that we only talk about these issues when we need to get people to vote for politically hard things, and then we forget about it in between. And what it takes is sustained attention. You can't educate people in community colleges by paying attention once every 10 years when you're trying to pass a trade agreement. You actually have to put together the union of education and business and government to always be there to respond in a way that gives people the skills they need. We just haven't had that sustained commitment. You know, I actually think one of the reasons for the populism is not just that we have failed in doing that, but it doesn't look to normal people like we're trying. And being ignored only adds to the despair.
Yeah, Nick, if I could just say one quick thing about this. We are very aware of the rural-urban divide. And just to go back quickly to your first question of the night, this is one of the reasons that we focus on insecurity instead of inequality, because if you look at the urban areas, they are, while the most robust and contributing the greatest to the economic growth of the country, they are also among the most unequal places there are. The rural areas are really quite equal. They're just not well off. And it's the inequality in the urban areas that is producing the populism from the left that Jack closed with, which I think is really very important. And we've seen it in places like France as well, with the yellow vests and the like. So I think when you think about populism, it's important to think about it from both the right and the left.
Michael, so we're going to go to questions very soon. There's a few questions in Q&A. I encourage those in the audience to send in more. But I want to ask you one more question, and that is, you talk a lot in the book about the success of the New Deal and delivering the kind of society, kind of economy that works more inclusively. So one dimension in here is regulation versus deregulation. The New Deal produced a bigger government with more government provision like Social Security and so on, but it also produced a much more regulated business sector. Finance was very, very heavily regulated, and industry by industry, Democratic Party governments set up agencies to regulate industries, and one could argue at least that essentially forced businesses to be more provider-like or paternalistic or caring toward people. And then deregulation, which began in the 70s, freed business not to be so concerned about those things. So the question is, would re-regulation be something that we should consider to solve these problems of insecurity and inequality?
Well, I think it's going to get the attention of businesses. That is, re-regulation is going to get the attention of businesses. I don't think it's a substitute for the kinds of policies of creating jobs and raising after-tax pay and creating a safety net of the sort that we talk about for unemployment and health care and the like. I think those have to be done by government, and they require money to do. But I do think that that's part of what's motivating the antitrust renaissance. Columbia is probably the headquarters at the moment of the antitrust renaissance. And the idea is to bring some of these companies to heel, and it may be motivating some of the companies to talk about a more inclusive form of corporate governance. You know, we had in the New Deal, we had communism that was a real, genuine threat, and socialism as an idea that people were really gathered around. And we haven't had, in this period from the 70s until now, a real alternative to the kind of free market economics that took over, beginning with the Reagan administration, maybe some would say with the Carter administration. And so I think that may be part of the downside. And when you have to have something to lose as well as something to gain. And there is something to lose, and and some regulation. I mean, obviously, I've written a book on energy policy and climate issues, and there you really do need, if not regulation, you need energy taxes and the like. So you need to put businesses' feet to the fire in a number of ways in order to get them to do what needs to be done. But I agree with you as a matter of observation, the fact that there's been no alternative to deregulation and free market economics for a long time has made.
And just to add a tiny observation, when we use phrases like corporate social responsibility, it means very different things at different times. In the 50s, it meant, de facto lifetime employment, unionization, pensions, healthcare. Now it tends to mean more things like commitment to anti-racism and decarbonization, those kinds of causes that are wonderful causes, but don't put, security into the average person's life as much. So that's, I'd say, part of the picture too. Jack, any words before we go into questions?
At the risk of getting into the weeds, a lot of the things that we really need to do, as Michael says, require resources. And one of the reasons you don't see a sustained effort to fix the unemployment system is to come up with the resources to do that, except at a moment of crisis, is almost impossible because you can't get agreement on how to pay for it. And at a moment of crisis, everyone says, we don't have to pay for it, it's crisis. So that's why for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, you can do it. But you end up with a system that's fundamentally broken. And if right now we said, how do we fix unemployment for the next 20 years? It would have an enormous cost. And nobody would want to come up and pay the bill. So we do something to get it through the next 6 months. I think that's also one of the reasons why regulation tends to become the focal point of attention. There are existing authorities that presidents can use to, have the executive branch put regulations in place. At a moment of either political dysfunction or unwillingness to find resources, it sometimes becomes the only tool you have. And the ideal tools that might actually create better outcomes for the business community aren't on the set of options you can do by yourself. And if you can't get the system to work, that makes it impossible.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to go to questions. Let's see. There's a lot of good questions here. Here's one. What are the long-term consequences of the black-white wealth gap, which hasn't narrowed in half a century? And I just add to that, not only the consequences, but causes and potential solutions.
Well, I think that the wealth gap is a huge problem in the United States. And again, I come back to that number that I started with, which was a $400 emergency is devastating. to so many people. There's some good ideas, I think, around building wealth over time. Cory Booker has a baby bond idea of giving people money at the moment of birth and having those build up over time, and that might help. The black-white wealth gap, which is huge and has not narrowed greatly, is a very, very big problem, and I'm not sure it's a problem that's going to be solved overnight. There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for taking wealth away at the top, but in another book that Ian and I wrote together, we interviewed Bob Johnson, who was the first African-American billionaire, and he had gotten over 100 black millionaires to sign a petition basically saying to repeal the estate tax. And a majority of the Black caucus was for repealing the estate tax. They shocked Bill Clinton when he learned that. And Bob Johnson said to me, if I thought I could get an exemption for African-American wealth, I would. But if I have to repeal the tax, just as the African-Americans are getting a first generation of building wealth, in order to keep it in the African-American community, that's where I want to go. It's hard to think of a less progressive policy than repealing the estate tax if we put our minds to it. So this is a very deep and abiding problem, but it is a piece of what we've come to think of as the American dilemma, the problem of black-white relations.
Here's a question from my neighbor and your colleague, Jeffrey Gordon. Isn't the pivotal moment in the history that you survey the Reagan declaration that the scariest words are, "We're from the government, we are here to help"? That is, isn't the crucial question precisely the responsibility of government, the best match between government and enterprise? Isn't that what needs to be reworked? And I just throw another Reagan quote in there, the famous, government isn't the solution, government is the problem.
Look, I think the war on government for much of the last 25 years has been a real problem. It's led to a lack of confidence in the ability of government to solve problems, which makes it harder to put together the kinds of coalitions that Michael is talking about. And I think it's fundamentally misguided, because I don't think it was true in the 80s that government was the problem. And it wasn't great, when I was working for President Clinton, when he said the era of big government is dead. So it became kind of a almost theology that you had to prove that you weren't for government in principle. I actually was proud of the fact that in the Obama administration, we were restoring some confidence in government bit by bit. It wasn't great that the Affordable Care Act rollout didn't work well, but we turned it around really quickly. And it turned out people didn't want to give up the coverage that came in the Affordable Care Act, even after it became the focal point of political war. So I think we actually have to live in a world where we don't get to roll the clock back and take away the 25 years of attacking government, but we can't give up on either the ability to fashion solutions in government or the need to attract talented people into government. I mean, one of the side effects of the war on government is people have to be proud to go to work for the government, not feel like it's something to apologize for. I was privileged to work in organizations in government that had, barring none of the private sector or academic places I've worked, the highest level of talent in one place. But that's not how people think of the government. And that takes people actually talking about it.
Here's another question, and I guess I'll pose this to you, Michael, since it's based on something you said. Please explain why employer-based health insurance does not work for either businesses or employees.
Well, as I said, it was an accident of wage and price controls back in the post-war era. It was a way of raising wages without violating wage controls at the time. It was completely accidental. We're the only country that really relies as heavily as we do on ensuring people at a working age through their employers. You know, if in the period, Nick, when you were talking about working with the Washington Post and you had one job for a lifetime, employer-based health insurance wasn't so bad. But we now know that people are going to change jobs 10 or 12 times at least during a lifetime. When you go from one employer to another, you are given different choices about what your insurance may be. You may have to change doctors as well as employers. We know if you're unemployed, we've seen this during the pandemic, health insurance often disappears when the job disappears, which is the worst possible time for that to happen. And we see that we're paying now, because of our fragmented system, a greater share of our economy for health care and health insurance than any other country in the industrial world. And so if we want to get control of costs, we're going to have some monopsony purchasers as well. And so it gives us poor coverage. It's distributed badly in the sense that it's the higher wage, larger business companies that have the most robust coverage. And it's a source of great insecurity. And we've got an expensive system so that if you have a health incident, you can go bankrupt as well as going to the hospital, as we now know. And so the Affordable Care Act was a great mechanism to get people a system, an alternative system to the employer-based system. And we think that there are ways to build on that, either by allowing people to elect into Medicare or other public programs, but that we need to move gradually away from it. The problems of transition here are really worth mentioning. It is very hard to take a system that's as large as the health insurance system and employer-based health insurance and change it overnight. You have to be willing to do it incrementally over a long period of time and put in place systems that will be stable over time. The Affordable Care Act has had this crazy political back and forth despite its success, where the Republicans keep talking about repealing and replacing it, but they don't have a replacement. And so, I think it's something that's going to be changed over a significant period of time, but I think we have to really move away from employer-based health insurance. Small businesses have huge problems because of pre-existing conditions, or they have one bad health incident and then the costs go way up.
But if you look at the reason that it's hard to come up with any sensible alternative, it's that people are very attached to the health insurance they have. If you go back to the Harry and Louise ads against the Clinton health bill, it was, they're going to take your health insurance away. President Obama, said, if you like your insurance, no one will take it from you. You can find cases where people couldn't keep their insurance, and he was called a liar because even though 99% it was true, there were the examples. And that's another way of saying the transition is a long, hard one, because I don't think that we as a country are ready to give up what people get in their employer-based insurance anytime soon. And the patchwork is what you're left with.
Let me read out another question, and here it is. It's a little longer than the ones I've been posing. Is there a definition for equitable wages? There are a lot of factors that have changed over the years. How many people need to work full-time to support a family? How many in that family? How far away from the job do they have to live? And what level of lifestyle does it need to support? HHS poverty level is much too low to keep people in a very crowded apartment and basic nutrition in some places. In other places, you might be able to get by. Or is it based on income inequality between highest paid and lowest paid?
Well, there's a lot of talk about what constitutes a living wage. I think it does vary geographically. I think that's one of the reasons that some people on both the Republican and the Democratic side are concerned about a national level of a minimum wage, because wages vary, because costs of housing and food and healthcare and everything else vary greatly across the country. But I think there's a lot of agreement about what's a living wage. I do think we've now decided that the economy has decided for us that most families need two earners, and issues of marriage and what's happened to the family are extremely important in that context, and we don't talk about them much in the book, and we haven't talked about them much tonight. But they're very important issues of having two workers and marital segmentation. It used to be that doctors married their nurses, and now they marry other doctors, and so forth. And so it's contributing. All of these cultural issues are contributing to both inequality and, in the case of a lot of single parents, insecurity.
Jack, do you want to add to that?
I think the minimum wage issue is different now than it was even 6 years ago when I was in policy discussions. 6 years ago, I would have been sympathetic to the argument that Michael made that there are communities where $15 is a little bit on the high side. I think that for most of the country, it's hard to call $15 an hour,
I agree with that.
More than a modest wage. And if we're really concerned about income inequality in this country, it means that people at the workplace have to earn more. And you're seeing states move towards the higher minimum wage one by one. That creates inequalities between states, and you don't want it to become attractive to create your jobs in a state that's a race to the bottom low wage state. So I've actually changed my view that you asked about politics versus policy. I would plead guilty for most of my career being a little bit too aggressive on the policy versus the politics side. If I saw moral hazards, I tried to avoid them. If I saw inefficiencies, I tried to avoid them. The result of that is often better policy that people don't understand, it's too complicated, and it doesn't work in the sense of people feeling like you've addressed the problem. I've actually gotten much more tolerant of accepting some risk of moral hazard and some inefficiency.
Okay, unless you want to add, Michael, I'm going to go to another question.
I just want to say one thing. I'm not as negative on the minimum wage as it might have sounded. I think a $15 number over time is probably quite fine. But but it is a good example where the politics of regulation and telling somebody else to pay for something is much better than the politics of paying for it through taxes. And the anti-tax, anti-government movement, which I'm now writing about, has had a huge impact in creating opportunities for a policy like that, which I think is second best to the earned income tax credit, but it's not something that I am opposed to. I just wish we could actually do more.
And I'm a huge advocate of the earned income tax credit. I'm proud on many occasions to have played a hand in increasing and expanding access to the earned income tax credit. So I don't disagree at all. I do think there's something different between the dignity of a wage and the earned income tax credit. I think that there is something lost when your income isn't coming in the form of traditional wages. And the earned income tax credit kind of grew out of people shouldn't be on welfare. They should be encouraged to go to work. And we shouldn't tax them going to work by taking away their welfare and taxing them. And it was a very good policy solution that then lent itself to growing into a much more substantial income maintenance program. But it's not the same as a wage.
Well, this leads to, let's spend a minute on universal basic income, since it's out there and you talk about it in the book.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a word or two about it. It's very interesting, because one of the things we discovered when we were writing the book is that if you were looking for one thing that Martin Luther King and Milton Friedman agreed on, it was universal basic income in the early 1970s. And how can you be against something that Friedman and Martin Luther King Jr. Thought was a good idea? This is where politics really takes over for us. We just don't think there is any coalition that will be effective for a universal basic income, certainly at the national level. And the reason for that is really quite straightforward, which is that the left, including Andrew Yang and others have talked a lot about it, want to add it to all existing programs. And the people on the right, Charles Murray and others who have talked about it and support it, want to substitute a universal basic income for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and so forth. And so it's just very hard for me to visualize, certainly at the national level, the idea that you can get a coalition to agree on a universal basic income and agree on whether it's an addition to the existing system or a substitute for everything else. And as a substitute for everything else, I wouldn't support it. I think it's not a good substitute for everything else.
At the risk of contradicting myself on inefficiency, I think you also have to worry about writing checks to people who don't need them. And we're seeing a form of that in the debate over the stimulus payments.
Right.
Because I have a hard time, justifying, large stimulus checks to families that haven't lost their income at a time when, even if we're not paying for it, we still have ultimately resource constraints. In a world where you can't pay for everything, UBI tends to not be distributed to the people who need it the most. And I don't think we're going to be living in a world forever where we don't look for the price tags of the things we're doing.
Let me go back to another question. We're getting down to our last few minutes here, but I think we have time for a couple more. What solutions do you suggest for well-educated and well-trained segments of the population that face economic insecurity because they face age and other types of discrimination?
Well, it's very hard for me to answer that question, because I've been teaching now for so long, and I'm a beneficiary of the Age Discrimination Act, which allows me to continue teaching even now. And I'm going to stop soon, but I have to say, we do have anti-discrimination laws that can be enforced. The difficulty, of course, is that when you lose your job in your 50s or so, it's very hard to find reemployment. And particularly, it's very hard to find reemployment if the skills in your previous job are not skills that are widely desired in new jobs. And here we look very heavily to community colleges as a bridge for people moving from one job to another. But I think anti-discrimination laws, whether we're talking sex or age or race, are extremely important and have really helped to begin to transform America. They're not adequate, but they've been very helpful. And so I'm a big supporter of them, but they're certainly not a solution to all of these problems of economic insecurity.
Jack, anything to add to that? Or
Yeah, I think we have to think about people at different ages in different ways in terms of what they need if they're subject to disruption. I'm not going to address the discrimination issue directly because I want to pick up on a different point Michael made. You look at the impact of technology on somebody who's 25 and somebody who's 55, it's a different phenomenon entirely. You could send me back to community college for 10 years and I would not learn how to be a computer programmer or the designer of a computer chip. I think the reality is when people are disrupted at a point in their career where they're not going to go back and fundamentally change their path, you have to look at how do you help them manage towards retirement or the next step with dignity. And something like wage insurance, where if you got a lower paying job and you had some ability to maintain your prior lifestyle, would probably be a better answer than pretending that somebody is going to go from working on a loading dock to being a computer programmer. And, same thing would be true if you're a university professor and there's no university teaching jobs in your field. And we're just not good at having nuanced approaches. There's one set of challenges for the kids who are coming out of school, post-secondary now. There's another set for the people who are disrupted in their 25 to 35. Once you get into late or middle-late career, it's much more challenging. And I don't think we've been ever willing to confront that honestly.
Okay, so I'm going to do a couple more questions. We're getting right to the end, so these will be sort of lightning round. So here's one. Given that the bottom 50% of American families by wealth own 1% of the stock market, are there policies that you think get more stock into more broadly distributed hands? And could equity redistribution policies have any material impact on inequality?
Look, I have a view that if we did something about the taxation of unearned income, particularly income that passes on from generation to generation and never gets taxed, and use that to fund a combination of things like community college education, better child care, things that give people opportunity, without having a direct income redistribution program, you could accomplish those goals. But that would mean something that people would call a death tax, because that's when the lack of taxation of capital wealth happens the most.
Okay, I'm going to just ask one more. Now we have a situation where the right realizes that they are served by a population that is not educated, and some of them seek to dumb down those in rural America. How do we deal with that, where there is no longer consensus that education is useful to economic advancement and security and is essential to the function of a democracy?
Well, I think, if Jack and I are right about technological change being the major disruptor of employment and wage income going forward, which I think it likely will be, there is no substitute for education. People are going to have to be educated, and I think we really have to do better about that. Jack just talked about the inheritance tax and so forth, but if you're looking at economic insecurity and you're looking at the way in which education is funded in the United States, the use of property taxes to fund public education, in which the U.S. is a huge outlier, is probably one of the most important policies that has produced both insecurity and inequality over a very long period in the United States. And so there is no substitute for education. If people want to resist education, they're going to have problems. I think the bigger problem is the problem of people who want the education who are anxious to lift themselves up through better education and are stuck because the school in the neighborhood is not doing that for them. I've got a daughter who teaches school, and I've seen her do it, and it can be done with underprivileged kids, but it is a constant effort, and it takes dedicated teachers and resources. But there is no substitution, I think, for education going forward.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Thanks very much. I just want to hold up the book, The Wolf at the Door. You can go online and order it right now, preferably many copies. And thank you both for a really interesting discussion where, you know, we just barely scratched the surface of the huge subject that Michael and Ian cover very adeptly and understandably in this book. So thanks a lot to both of you and to all of you who have come.